Thank you very much. Yay, item. So I'm really glad the folks of you who did not raise your hands, thank you so much for being here, and for the folks that did raise your hands. And I can't see out into the ether space, but hopefully at least 2 people raise their hands out there. We're really excited to bring it to RDA. So there, in short, there was an event that took place at one of AGU's society meetings a few years ago, where we were talking about all of the existing challenges with data citations, and Deb Agarwal was there and brought to us the one that she's been working on, which turns out to be the one that many of us have been working on. We know that journals really don't like to have more than 30, 40, 50 citations for data within their papers. It is a lot of reasons for that. First of all, they're not good with data citation at all to start with. And I can say that because I come from a journal, or several journals. And so one of the challenges is, if with more and more complex work in certain disciplines that use many data sets and software and images and other kinds of digital products that support research, how do we package that up to make it easy to go through the entire publication process and then realize that all of these things support a particular effort? And there are words for this. I will let Martina explain the word challenge. And we started with the concept of complex data citations, and realized very quickly we can't call it that, because there's really a lot of other digital products. So we started having scrappy meetings, which were wildly successful, and all of those are recorded, so you can all catch up. The links are in the page for this session, so you can listen on twice the speed and hear us all as chipmunks if you want to, and get caught up on how we got to where we are. However, we will have a summary in this session, and invite you all to join us. We just got approved as an RDA working group, like minutes ahead of this meeting, which is the only reason they let us have it. Follow the rules. And we're really hoping to bring the work thus far to RDA, get additional use cases, get additional feedback, have additional folks working with us, and take it forward such that credit for the children within this collection. Okay, I just used words. Okay, if anybody's out there having opinions on the words I just used, just set the opinions aside. And so that if you are a creator of a data set used for research, you will get attribution for having that data set used. That's really very key here. So the group thus far has included Caroline Coward, Chris Erdman has been helping us, as well as Justin and James from BODC, Justin Buck and James Olive, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He just gave a talk on this like a day or so ago in IODE, which is happening simultaneously this week. And so we are really excited. So Martina Stockhouse is going to take it away, and I will be delighted to pass the baton over. Leslie Wyborn and Deb Agarwal are online, and they are also co-chairs.
So yeah, thank you, Shelley. I think you have summarized the whole idea and the whole session in your welcome.
Great.
So I will do the bit boring stuff for half of the room, because I will introduce the 3 use cases that we use to shape the proposal for RDA for the working groups. Let's see. Is it just
arrows or the pointer?
I use the arrows. So I will just introduce the problem along the 3 use cases we have. So as Shelley introduced, we have Justin and James contributing a use case from a repository, the BOEDC. We have Deb, who contributed the first use cases from the AmeriFlux and FluxNet projects, and I contributed the example from the last IPCC assessment report. So So the main problem for the Ameriflux example is that you see that the data is collected at different sites, stored in multiple repositories, and the problem is that the users want to cite these large hundreds of data sets in their papers. So that's usually, as Shelley has introduced, too long for any editor, so you get complaints. So the question is, how do you cite these many data sets stored in many repositories? And of course, assign the proper credit to the authors of these elements within the reliquary, how we called it, or collection. So we came up with the word reliquary just to make sure that there's no misunderstanding with the terminology that is used within other working groups. The second use case from a repository, for that you have to understand that BODC has very different kind of data and even samples in their repository. They collected during cruises and other activities. So they organize these data sets within collections. So it's possible to cite elements and the collection. And the use case within a paper or a research study is that you use subsets of these large collections and combine it into new subsets, into new larger data sets. So their collections contain subsets of these existing collections. So this is one repository with many subsets in a reliquary. And I would say that the IPCC use case brings both together. So we are fighting with many data sets which went into the report, especially we look at in the figure creation process. So we have many data sets stored in multiple repositories. And the main aim that we had for the FAIR guidelines was to enhance the transparency and make the figures traceable and ideally reproducible. So we have the additional idea that we want to capture the information that is necessary to reproduce it. So we have input data, we have the scripts, we have some kind of provenance information which combines these two to create the final data. So that is our challenge in the end. And we use these three use cases to develop the working group proposal here. And of course, we are interested to have additional use cases which cover the additional parts of why it's still difficult to cite data. And now I will hand over to Deb, who will give a more concrete example why we need this new working group. Deb?
Thanks so much, Martina. Can you guys all hear me?
Yes.
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 Awesome. All right. I think I'll leave my video off just since it's the middle of the night for me, or close to it. Yeah, Martina already introduced what I'm going to talk about, so let's go ahead to the next slide. So as Shelley talked about, here we're talking about this challenge of where you need to cite, let's just say, greater than 50 resources in a paper, and it could be up to millions. And you'll hear from Leslie some examples where, in fact, it is much larger than 50, considerably larger. And as Martina pointed out, in many cases, this will be places where these different resources are coming from different repositories. So having a solution where it's solved by having the solution inside one repository is of limited use to many of these cases. So another challenge part of this is that if you have a license like the CC BY 4.0 license on those original resources, then, and they've asked for citation as the acknowledgement, then there is that challenge of how do you still meet the license requirements when in fact the typical publisher guidance to paper authors has been, oh, just put those citations in the supplementary material, which we all know is not machine readable, and it's unclear that that meets the usage license. Or they ask, we've often seen them ask, we've had them ask us to drop or combine citations or summarize them to enable fitting them in, even in a data paper. So next slide. So what I thought I'd do to just quickly show sort of how this happens and what happens, I want to bring a real use case, because I really thought that either collections or dynamic data citation were going to work for solving the simplest of my use cases. And that's just thinking about FlexNet. So FlexNet's a global data set made up from underlying data sets that were contributed by 212 different teams around the world. Okay, so those different teams have each spent anywhere from 2 to 20 years collecting that data. And so it's non-trivial data sets inside this FlexNet 2015 collection that we have, okay? And so our, at first we said, okay, well, how are we going to enable citations of this data set? Well, let's make a collection, right? So, and then the idea would be that the users cite the collection. So the pro was that, we could do it ourselves, right? We could, at the FlexNet repository, we could implement that. But one of the first things we hit is it's non-trivial to do it. And also when people use it, you don't get the reusability and traceability. It's extremely difficult to trace the credit for the data sets at all. And also, typically in the collection, you don't really have an authorship for that citation. And so those were all challenges that we hit as roadblocks. And we thought, well, I wonder about dynamic data citations. So we started looking into implementing that as our method. And then having that every time someone downloaded a subset of the FlexNet data, that they would get a custom dynamic data citation to use for their paper. Again, the con is there's no authorship in the citation. We actually, that would have been a non-trivial effort for us to implement that whole capability, such that we could build the dynamic citation, that we could do the tracing for the credit and all those things. And we've seen larger repositories like the ocean one, some of the biology ones have done this, but we're a very small repository in this case. So that was really not an option. In addition, we have statistics about the downloads, and over 50% of the users download the entire set, but use a much smaller subset of that. And so it really would have made that dynamic data citation quite inaccurate unless we force them to come back and do a new query with what data sets they were actually using. Next slide. So, and the only available solution we had to find the criteria that all of the contributors were willing to accept was if we wrote a high prestige paper. And by high prestige, I mean that it was going to be in science, a science level publication, Science and Nature, which they all love having. So by doing that, we could have that all of the authors could be part of the authorship of that paper. It could be the citation for the set. It could, and one of the big advantages, it could also include the central team that puts this data set together, which we typically were never able to provide credit to. But, the publication, of course, immediately came back and said, you have a limit of 500 authors, which we had 212 data sets inside. So that meant we had to very much limit down the authorship to only the primary, PIs of each of the sites, which they actually agreed to. And in the end, it took us 4 years to build this paper because Science and Nature also insisted that we have new data, new results, and we had to get agreement from all of the sites that they do CC BY for. We had to get agreement as to who would be their authors. So literally that took 4 years. Next slide. So the great part of the paper as a result is it's been highly cited. And people are managing to write papers using this data set. And we're not getting complaints from the contributors of the data, which is always one of my gauges. And users are able to do this. And we're getting credit to the central processing team, which has really been nice. I don't like the fact that most of the contributors of the data sets, in fact, aren't part of the authorship. We're also treating all the data sets as equal in this sort of a model. And some of those data sets are 25 years worth of data collected, and some of those are 1 year worth of data collected. And so they really aren't equal. And there's some data sets where there's enough quality issues where they're rarely used by papers, and there's some where they're incredibly high quality and they're always used. It also limits the reusability and traceability about what was used, because generally then people provide a table or something else that says what sites they actually used. But that's very difficult to actually interpret and properly count. And we're now moving to regular releases of this FluxNet data set. And so they should be coming out on the order of every 6 months. And so writing a paper again is really not realistic at all. But this is the citation for the actual paper if anyone's interested to look at what we ended up doing there. Next slide. So Martina already talked about the use cases, so let's go on, and Leslie's going to give you some of the additional ones. Next slide. So again, what we're really looking for is something that would allow us to have this large number of citations where you can really trace the individual citations to the underlying resource, and specifically the resource that the author is referring to, not some mega container that they're sitting in purely. So we've had this community practice, as Shelley mentioned, since December of 2020, that we've been working with to look at this. We've gathered use cases. We've spent a lot of time sort of working through those. We've talked to the publishers, quite a few repositories, actually some of the indexers. A fairly broad range of people have been involved in this, including some of the groups working on some of the different types of mechanisms that might make sense. And we've been, as Martina mentioned, we've been using this word reliquary mostly for name collision problems. We're hoping we come up with a better name before the end. But it's served its purpose to be something unique for now. And where we're really at this point, after meeting for 2 years, is we've really worked through trying to understand, at least for the use cases that we have, where the challenges are, and then what we've done most recently is really we've built sort of what I call a cocktail napkin version of these reliquaries, just to look at, do I even know what I'd put in it and how I'd try to use it, and are these feasible? And so in our working documents, you'll find that we have these cocktail napkins for our 3 main use cases to sort of show what would be in a reliquary, which I find to be kind of the core element. And I think the other thing I want to stress is we're not doing this effort because we think we have to do everything from whole cloth new. It's more because we want to get together the requirements and what we need to be able to represent. And we're actually hoping that one of the current mechanisms can be leveraged to meet the complex citation needs of these reliquaries. I hope fervently that we're not going to need to actually go off and do everything from whole cloth. So please, if you think your mechanisms already meet most of this and where we could, with small amount of change, maybe meet the needs of a reliquary, that would be perfect situation from our perspective. Next slide. I think that might be my last slide. Yes, on to Leslie.
Okay, so can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so these are just use cases that I'm coming across right now with projects that I'm working on, which is kind of why I connected with the work that Deb and Shelley and Martina were doing, because these are like real world cases that are happening right now. So next. And so there's one in geophysical network, one in physical samples, and one in geochemical data compilations. Next. So the first case is geophysical networks, e.g. seismology. And that figure on the left is of Perth. And you can see here we have the SWAN array, and each purple dot is a separate site where there's a seismometer deployed. And since 2014, the FDSN has issued DOIs for a seismic network. But when you go into the paper, the description of the DOI it's almost like a mini abstract or a paper in words, and include number, location, types of sensors, instruments, geographical coverage, etc. And so the FDSN network DOI is a composite beast that was defined in 2014 based on the 2013 data site metadata schema. And if you go into that, many of the things we now assign DOIs to, such as instruments, locations, derived data set samples, etc., were not part of this schema. What some of the seismologists are finding is that the publishers are not happy with this FDSN DOI for data submitted with the publications, as they may not actually directly link to the data set that was used in the publication. So in effect, I feel this FDSN DOI is one of the earliest reliquaries in that they're being used to aggregate multiple artifacts, in which we can now put DOIs or PIDs on the components within it. But if we do that, you can't trace the individual components within it. Next. So this is another case where whoopie-doo, I got a grant to go to the Vestfold Hills in Antarctica, and I collected hundreds of samples. The field costs were pretty high. This is just a scenario. This never happened to me because in my youth, women weren't allowed to go to Antarctica. But anyway, each rock I collect is the toilet and shower facilities weren't suitable, I was told. Okay, so on my field trip, each rock I collect was assigned an IGSN, and my full sample collection goes into a public repository for access and use by others. I sit down and write a series of paper using these samples, but I use different combinations. So I write a paper on the pink rocks and one on the grey rocks and maybe one on the whole lot and so on. Each IGSN for each sample remains the same, but the combination of samples for each paper is different. So what I'd like to call is a combination, a reliquary, and give each combination a separate ID but still be able to identify each time I publish an individual sample and measure the impact of collecting this sample and acknowledge the funders for the expensive field work. Now, as I say above, I have put those into a public repository, and others are now reusing my samples and doing additional analytical work. And they'll do the same thing. They'll make up, write a paper that has so many samples, but if you've got more than 200, you can't trace the individual samples. So I've got no idea of who is using my samples, or more importantly, if they're doing extra analytical work that would help me enhance my understanding of my own samples, I'd like to be able to get it. But under current practices, I don't have a hope in hell of doing it. The next one is quite common. If we move on to the next slide, please. This is happening all over the place, and we're sort of moving from reductionist science to doing compilations and looking at global patterns. And so what's happening is these compilations are coming more and more commonplace, and it's easier to do national and international visualizations of data or provide syntheses if you've got them all together. So what Geoscience Australia did was they created this publication, compiled 878 samples from over 100 publications. The DOIs of the source publications and any sample are stored in a separate supplementary database. Now, if you look at this visualization, that's Tasmania, and there's an online GIS, and I can go in and draw a bounding box and select certain samples. But when I do download that, all I get is the DOI of the publication that compiled them. And so any researcher whose data is being made available in these compilations doesn't know where and when their work is being recited, reused or cited. So a reliquary would enable at least the original source publication, if not the identifiers for the individual analyses and for each sample, to be cited and the impact measured. That's just my use cases. Thank you.
So the last bit which we want to show you is we have worked on the content of the reliquary. So we have drafted some reliquaries. There are spreadsheets available. The links are on the next slide, but just I want to introduce the different sections we came up for the different kinds of information we think could go into a reliquary. And I do that along with the IPCC example. So the first part is just to identify the reliquary and have an information how to cite it. So there are authors, maybe if we use PIDs, we have not decided if a DOI or a PID, of if we use always a DOI or sometimes a PID if we say we don't need authors. In the example for the IPCC, I think we should have the authors of the work compiling the figure. The second part describes the content of the reliquary, and I looked into an example, so the figure 10.18, if someone wants to look into that in the first part of the IPCC report, where the last part was just published this Monday. If you look into the content, what the authors provided to us are scientific papers, we have data papers, we have data sets, so real references to data sets, and we have data collections. So that is the different kind of information we deal with.
What do you mean by data collection in this context?
I'm thinking about the CMIP examples. You can cite large collections, but you don't know which data sets within were used. And that brings me to the next section. So if you want to trace back or reproduce the figure, you need exact information which data sets within these large collections. So a collection is a model run. It makes sense to cite it together, because if you want to know where was my model data used, it makes sense to have a single DOI for the metrics. But for reproducibility, you need the data set information, and we have handles on each data set. So that would be the next part of information for our example, which we need. It's not completed because it was manual work at the moment, and that just to mention it here, we need a process or a tool which is easy to use for authors. Otherwise, we will never get the information from them. And the last part is relations. So how is this reliquary connected to other pieces of information? So for the IPCC, we have the report itself, we have the printed version, we have the digital version, we have chapters, we have the full report. We also have code, which was applied to create the figure. We have the final or figure data set. So that is what you see in the figure in the end. And what we would like to introduce for the next time is provenance records for traceability. So how is the code and the input data combined? And it would be thinkable, there are some Jupyter notebooks around and provided by some authors. So if we could link that together somehow, not only how to produce it, but also have a notebook where you can do it. And maybe ORCIDs for authors that was brought in by James and Justin. So that would be a possibility if we want to do that. Deb, do you want to add something for your use case, if there is something special?
No, I think you covered the gist. I'd like to have us have an opportunity to hear from folks who joined the meeting. And I think the best thing would be to first take questions.
Yeah. Thank you.
Do we have a microphone? Yeah, do we have a microphone or just the microphone should catch? Okay, just speak up.
Okay.
I ask online if they can hear us.
Okay. So, are we initially talking about collections of datasets or subsets that have a DOI?
Online people, could you hear the question?
Yeah, we can hear the questions.
Okay. Do you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, we're mostly assuming that the resources have some sort of a identifier, not necessarily DOIs. I think that's open for discussion.
Okay, because I'm thinking that if it is in a DOI, and DOIs have metadata that are linked data, you very easily can extract any kind of information you want in a database like. So if you have the database that can give you URLs for what you want to search in, and then use this URL to get your authors, to get your everything, I think you solve a big part of your problem. But for now, I'm only talking about DOIs. So if DOIs are all in a database, it's called Sparklet Point. It's a triple store database, a graph one. They I don't know if they have it out, but they use linked data. You can create queries, get a URL, and that URL is what you need to cite, because that will give you all the information that you want, because it's already in DataCite.
If the information is in DataCite, yeah, that's of course something we don't want to replicate.
No.
But there might be some relations for the reliquary. So for this bundle of information, if you look into the IPCC, the individual, say, data sets of CMIP don't reference necessarily the code which is used to create a figure. So it's not necessarily that you get all the information from the components within the reliquary. But we can use the metadata and the existing technology as much as possible, and we should do that.
Yeah,
And I think I think the other point I want to make is that we really need to have that the author of any paper could be able to create a reliquary and make it usable in the ways that we need. You know, we've tried to illuminate through these use cases. And I wanted to call on Leslie. She's got her hand up.
Online.
Yep, and then Kirsten's online as well and wants to say something. Just addressing the comment of the previous speaker. Yes, I do actually believe you could do this if you use DataCite DOIs. But the trouble is, like for a lot of samples and data types like I talked about, people are using handles or arcs. They're not using DOIs. And particularly where you're talking about the reliquary having, you know, like thousands of samples, which is quite possible with, say, physical samples, unless people are using DataCite DOIs for all the individual components, that's not a solution. Kirsten, would you like to say something?
Just 1 second. And then we have a couple questions in the room.
Yeah, thanks for, because it's just continuing what Leslie and Martina were saying. I think once you have the information in the DataCite metadata, everything is perfect, but the reliquary working group is aiming at providing means to make this happen, which means on a data publication site, it's pretty easy if you have a domain repository to include hundreds of IGSN in the metadata. But if you go to the node, you have to make it manually. And the most important is that publishers do not allow for so many citations. And if I speak about, for example, GNSS stations, which might come with individual station DOIs because they cannot adopt the concept of the network similar to seismology, we will have 500 plus citations. And this is the challenge, is to bring this into the XML metadata used for DOI registration, whether it is with DataCite or with Crossref. And this is, in my opinion, the purpose of this working group, to really develop a concept that somehow unpacks the reliquary and makes sure that the information is included.
I would add on, before we get to the questions in the room here, I would add on, I've been doing a lot of work in my own support at HU to figure out why data citations are having trouble getting through the publication process. I can assure you that the journals are not set up to deal with all of the other persistent identifiers. They can barely get DOIs to work, and frankly, many of them aren't actually working for data citations. So we don't want to tell a journal to figure out how to deal with a software heritage ID or an IGSN. It is not going to go well. It'll never happen. So if we take it out of the journal responsibility, then we have a better shot at actually making it work. So this lady right here in blue.
Okay, so I'm Raina Jenkins. I'm the data stewardship manager at Ocean Networks Canada. A bunch to say on this topic. One thing I don't see, we are actually already doing, we're calling them collections. We're using the DataCite collection. And to be in the DataCite collection, it's not just, and we're doing it for the purpose of our end users who want to kind of compile their data sets for this exact purpose of simplifying their publication citation. But it's not just DOIs that you can put in a collection. It's pretty much almost any kind of PID. You just say has part, and you can link to really any PID as long as there is a PID in the list, long list that DataCite allows for you to include in the list. So it's pretty broad. But we are doing that already and finding that it's a bit manual, but we are right now actually we're building a tool that the users will be able to do it themselves. So we just put a prototype starter point, which is like allowing for users to see, at least within data they downloaded from us, their search history, and then they can, and right now it's just showing their search history, but the next step is to allow them to click and choose which queries they've done in the past and kind of combine them into a collection themselves manually. So that would be at first limited for them to create a collection DOI from things they've downloaded from us. Maybe in the, but I could see the need for, but then they could take that collection and make, I don't know, I think there is a need for this and something more abstract or whatever this is, for them to combine collections or data sets from different sources institution-wise, but And I don't know exactly how that is because, you know, one of the challenges I see is that like for us, it's fine for us to build a little tool for them to make their own collection of data sets they downloaded from us, and we can kind of take that responsibility. But because you know, to DOI with data set, you kind of have, as a repository, you have to be part of the data site consortiums or whatever, and take the responsibility of holding that landing page of the collection and everything. So I think that's where the trouble is like some institution kind of has to hold that responsibility to carry that long-term management of that collection or reliquary or whatever you want to call it. I think that's where the issue is, like how do you get that authority or that responsibility taken care of? There are other questions around the like which contributors of names and organizations are associated to the collection itself. I think that's a bit of an issue, but I think like the data site collection concept is quite good in terms of like, well, one thing they don't do, if you use the PID graph right now, they don't have the capability to navigate through the collection down to the source or the has parts if you're going through the PID graph and trying to find relationships. But they know that's a problem, and I think they'll be adding that in time. So in time, you could just go to the PID graph and, you know, grab whatever connection points there are within the collections. It's not there right now, but I can see that being very soon. So I think a lot of it's there. Just I think there's this. I think it's the authority question for me. That's the big thing.
Yeah, I think it's not a technical problem, and we are aware that several repositories have implemented something like that. Even the BODC example has implemented collections. I agree that it's a problem of having the authority that one institution is responsible to maintain these reliquaries on the long term. And the other part is that all the components within the reliquary, the repositories providing these data sets, need to have persistency as well and maintain it. Just one comment in addition, I think the also tricky part will rely on Shelley and get this tracing of the credit into the common credit system so that you get it into these usage metrics, I think, as it's called. Yep. And I think that will be the really tricky part, and it's not so much a technical problem from my perspective.
See how Martina just gave that job to me. So the gentleman in the far back, and then Alexa, and then Uwe, and then Finn. Okay, all the way back.
And there's no online question.
Okay, thank God.
Okay, hello, Mike Bennett, DataSite, funnily enough.
Oh, hello, DataSite.
Yes. I'm a token DataSite code monkey in attendance at the conference, so thank you, for the use cases, because this will help inform how we develop stuff. Just to say a couple of quick comments. Yes, we can link out to arbitrary PIDs. If we don't yet support the PID type, please just send an email to the product team, and I'm very keen. But I had a kind of general question for the group, because you talk about the sort of idea of a reliquary, of a collection of other objects. So we already had some previous comments I mentioned about the data site collections, but I also think if you're talking to, say, create a DOI for a reliquary, it then becomes an object in itself as a collection. How do you see the interface of the metadata here? So in the reliquary, in the metadata there, do you propose to include all the contributors from all of the subcomponents at that top level? Or do you just say the contributor or the creator for this reliquary is the person who compiled the data, and then all of the actual data itself, you have to go in through the relationships into other places? How do you resolve that same issue with the citation that you have already, which is, well, okay, the person compiling the data is the data that was in the citation, and not the people who actually created the data?
Yes.
Yeah.
So Vim's dying. Vim's dying.
Just when you go of dance, just a quick comment in support of this, because what this means for metadata persistent identifier type environments like DataSite is that those related identifiers pointing to other persistent identifiers have to be tagged to say when you are computing citation credit, you've got to go one level deeper.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the system is not going to work.
That's the challenge.
How do you solve this?
So just so you know, I have talked to the Web of Science. The promise to, so there were two promises to them. And first of all, they talked to me. Okay. Let's acknowledge the miracle in there. And I talked to the right person. The promise, they didn't say they would do it, but they said we had to achieve two things. One, a consistent solution so that we as a community don't have 10 ways of doing this, but one way of doing it. So that's why the use cases are really going to matter, because we won't be able to get, we need to come together and endorse as a large community. That's why this project had to come to RDA. That's why you're all here. It has to be something we all say, yes, this will work for our use cases, or work well enough, right? The other thing they promised, I think we're going to have to push back on, was recursiveness. They don't want to go infinitely into children. So they're willing to go one level for sure. And if we have a use case, like the collection of collections, problematic for them. Now, we haven't handed them a to-do list yet. So if we have some sort of argument as to why we need to do that, that might be okay. But those were the two. So don't necessarily, the first one I think is an important boundary for us to have. Yes, we should all agree. The second one, we've heard so many arguments on why a collection of collections is important. So it's that one I feel like we're going to have to push back, because we might have to do that.
I don't think we should let Web of Science drive this.
Well, okay, me neither. We're being recorded, so talk to me later. But so we have, like, for instance, we should make sure, is anybody here from Open Air? We should talk to Open Air and get them to weigh in. We've already talked to Matt. So if you could join the working group, that would be brilliant, because we lost our data site person, and we'd like to marry back into data site.
Who was your data site person?
Martin Fenner.
Well, everywhere lost Martin Fenner.
Could you please come back? So, hang just a second, Carol. There are other hands that I gotta come. They're exhausted arms.
Okay, so because I didn't introduce myself, I'm Alexandra Kokinaki.
Alexandra, right.
I'm from BODC as well. So, if DataSite provides us with the Sparkle endpoint, you can actually get all of the information of a collection with inside an app, and you don't even care because you only provide the URL and the author. You go and do the work, and you leave them alone. You give them what they need without really thinking about this is a collection of a collection. So if the Sparkle endpoint is there, we can do that. BODC for collections, so EdMeds and series, we already have Sparkle endpoints. So I could suggest that you do a small experiment, a small use case, only for a complex citation of only DOIs, a complex citation of DOIs and BODC URLs, and see how that goes. Because Sparkle endpoints can hop between each other, so you can do federated queries between different Sparkle endpoints. So just
I think that's the more simple use case where you have a hierarchy of collections. So, but we deal also with subsets. So you use only pieces within. So we have to start somewhere, and it's good to have the this as first use case. But I don't think we should limit it to the UIs.
No,
that's my idea.
One use case.
One use case. Agreed. And also, please, this is so notional. I mean, if we're missing something here, then geez, hold on, Maggie. Carol's ahead of you.
I think Uwe was already.
Uwe's gonna die.
Before he dies.
But help me.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, I agree with most of the stuff. So it's really nice, and we have the same problem since very long time. In the early beginning of Pangea, always the same. People wanted to have a single DOI to cite all the data or something like that. And actually, that limit with something than more than 50 is okay. So actually, at the moment, we no longer agree on creating some arbitrary collections about less than 50 DOIs, because that can easily be cited in papers and it's much better. And for the other ones, we are also suggesting, and that's a little bit going in that final figure data set here, for example, I would also think of making that mandatory, because if you just have the reliquary with the citations of all those childs that were used, but that's all in that reliquary. It's just a list, so we call that somehow a bibliography or something like that. But if the people are working with the data and doing something and producing an output, we recommend to our users to also submit the output of the work to the data center, in our case to Pangea, and then they can cite on our side all the data sources they have used. So I have something like the combined work of both, which would be, in my opinion, the ideal way to do that, because then you don't only have this collection, but you also have an output which was created out of that collection, and then you have everything together, and then you can of course also have a paper about that. So that would be also, I think, a good idea. And about the authors here, I also agree that it's a problem. You cannot list all the authors of those child data sets used. And we are going in the route of calling them editors, although in the data side metadata. So that's the persons who collected together that data sets. We mention them as editors. And then internally we call those types of reliquaries editorial collection in our case. That's how we call them.
New word.
Yeah, new word, yes. So that's
okay.
Even a typo on my slide.
Thank you. Oh, sir, you had your hand up earlier, didn't you?
Yeah, but
All right. I got all the hands in the back. So okay, Carol.
Yeah, you sure you don't want to go?
well, just quickly, if that's
Yeah, go
okay.
ahead.
So Graham Parsman from CEDA, Centre for Environmental Data Analysis in the UK. So just like thinking about kind of the effectively, you have a methodology to kind of choose a selection of underlying items. To me, it sounds, you know, if you go back into the literature, you think about review papers, and that's kind of where you not only, you're listing all your citations of what you're actually reviewing, the other papers out there, but you're also writing why you've done that, what's your input as well. And I think here it's about kind of capturing not only the selections, but also why and how you've actually made those selections as well. And that's synonymous to kind of the editorial collection, I say. And I think, you know, that's an important aspect of why did you make the selection and how did you make the selection? And in capturing all of those parts, that in itself is something which you are putting effort into. And maybe there's you know, something that you can get credit for actually doing that bit of work and capturing that, which then connects through to all of the underlying assets, which, because it's one level down, it becomes traceable as well to get citation tracking.
That's really
Just a thought.
So it's really similar to what we thought in the IPCC, because it's a lot of work to provide the figures for the report, and you can get credit for that, or you should get credit for that as well. But also those who provided the components, so the input data, the scripts. So that was why we thought in this case it makes sense to have authors for the reliquary. There might be cases where you say it's editors, or you don't need any authors because it's just a composite in the end. You have not added some work to it. So then you might end up with a PID without a DOI. So no authors.
So you'll join the working group, right?
Yeah.
Like, don't you walk away
We have so
with
many
this.
CEDA colleagues. So CEDA is involved in that with the final data sets.
But you know, it's also a model which kind of the journals are used to already. You know, review papers, it's been their bread and butter for a while. So hopefully it's something synonymous they can
True, but I will, and Mark Parsons is in the back of my mind right now. Is he in the room? I'm not sure. But I really do think I think if we, yes, that's true, but we also, as part of RDA, want to lift the data and software products as their own research product. So what does that mean if we create this reliquary, this editorial collection? What does that mean exactly? It really leans into reproducibility. It leans into a scientific integrity that we maybe had many years ago when things were not digital, and you included what you included in your paper. So I think if we, yes, make it easier for journals, because otherwise, but also how, like you're saying, how can it be its own thing? So yeah.
And make it easy.
So Shelley, before you go on, can I just make a comment on some of this?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I love these ideas of like the editorial collection or things like that, and it would solve for many of the cases it could work. I will say something like the FluxNet collection. The reason why I keep bringing it up as a simple example is that it is more fundamentally like just having a huge bibliography, because it isn't so much that someone has done a massive amount of work to it. They've just run analyses of those couple hundred data sets, and they're publishing graphs and figures and results from having done those analyses. So there is no intermediate review paper or something they could write that makes sense or would want to write or be willing to write. And that's been the real challenge.
Yeah, I can add to that. The willingness to write a review paper is not there for our use case as well.
It's the methods section.
It's the method section.
Yeah, it's additional work, and that's what is difficult to get into the process usually. If it's simple, it's a different story.
Carol.
Yeah, thanks. We talked a lot about identifiers, but there's an entire alternate universe, which is digital objects, bare digital objects, ways of being able to collect these things together, which we're also working with DataCite, particularly in the Fair Impact project and a whole basket of other projects. And that hasn't really been mentioned at all, and it relates to your problem, your question about you're packaging these things together, and then you have metadata about the package itself. So when we originally started talking about this stuff back in the day, Shelley, we had a big piece about the packaging and using our own crates and digital objects in order to be able to do that, which I didn't see at all in the presentation. So I'm bringing it back in.
No problem.
Because that's, I think, is a key mechanism of being able to solve, where do I put the little graph bit, right? Because effectively what the digital objects are doing are carrying the graph, right, that we're talking about here. Moreover, there's a bunch of projects that are highly related to RDA that have to do this in the project. It's already written in to do large-scale citation, like multiple citation, mass citation, using digital objects in the biosciences world. So there's BioCovid, there's BGE, there's the BioDT, which is biodiversity digital twins. All of these projects have the same problem, and they're looking at using object-based and identifier-based solutions. So I'll bring those to the working group.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Keith, we have Maggie and Natasha, and then Keith. Maggie.
Yeah, Carol, so thanks for bringing up the fair digital objects, because that's what my comment is also related to. So I'm Maggie Hellström, I'm from ICOS, which is a European research infrastructure dealing with greenhouse gases and observations of that. And we also have a huge set, a little bit similar to Deb's FluxNet thing here. We also have Flux data, but we have many other types of data. Very many different individual data sets that we want to combine in different ways and make them available for our end users. So one of the things that we are looking into is really being able to use the so-called kernel information based of the handle-based persistent identifiers to add already at the registry level, like a tag, this is a collection or something like that, which is not really universally acceptable at the moment or used, but it's very possible and has been possible from day one of the handle system-based identifier systems. So I think that could be a key to being able to guide machine processes that find a PID, being able already at the resolution stage to understand, oh, this is a composite object, and I can launch it to do something. And not only this is a composite object, but from a vocabulary find out this is a RO crate, this is a reliquary, this is a data site collection object or something. And just one more comment about DataCite. I think DataCite is doing great things, etc., but we should not put all of our eggs in one basket. And also right now we are very global north oriented here. So there are very many nations out there who for various reasons, political, technological, whatever, are not able to directly launch into automatically using services like even the handle system or whatever. So we really need to not move in a direction where we are excluding large numbers of researchers also from disciplines who are not in the earth sciences or in the medical lab sciences. We may lead the way, we may point out this is a really good way of doing things, but we cannot have a lock-in.
Thank you very much for pointing that out. That's really important. And never mind, I lost it, missed it. Natasha, maybe it'll come back.
Okay, I'll just go on to them. Yeah, okay, so I will, first of all, I think this is really important and very good work. And the term reliquary is kind of a new one.
We didn't want it to stick, but guess what?
It doesn't really roll off the tongue, but I can't suggest an alternative. But anyway, aside from that, I mean, there's some really good use cases that we have heard here from the researcher perspective and from like the perspective of research centres and so forth. The group that I'm involved in, the data policy standardisation, is with the publishers and the publisher perspective, which I know that Shelley, you're very frustrated there, and I completely understand that. However, you know, maybe there's an angle that we can take there through the data policy standardisation interest group, because we are working on a piece that is looking to improve the data availability statements that are made through journals, because basically they're pretty rubbish. You know, all they do is reflect the status quo, really, that data are available on request, you know, and we want to really lift it. And I do think this ties into that. And we also are looking at sort of the machine readability aspect of the data availability statements as well. So I kind of like to tie this in a little bit to that thinking. So our group held a workshop with 10 different publishers about a month ago looking at the data availability statement, and you know, most of them agree that it's, you know, the average rating was 2.7 out of 5 for them. I would have actually rated the DAS statements a bit lower than that, but that's where they got to, and that's good. There's a recognition that we need to do something, and we're not where we want to be with that, which is putting the data in the repositories and having that reflected in the DAS statement. So if I'm just sort of raising that, and that I'll kind of be a bit of a connector between the groups here.
That would be really fantastic. So there is a lot of assumption in this group that the citation makes it into the reference section and is properly described in the availability statement, because it's not that's not really the purview here. But it would be fantastic.
I think though they need to know that this kind of thing, which is a shift away from where it has been, is kind of coming down the line and is something that is advantageous.
Yes, yes, yeah, that would be brilliant. Yes, thank you. That would be fantastic. Keith, you are up next. Hi, good to see you.
Nice to see you again. I'm Keith Jeffrey, past Director IT at the UK National Science Lab, and now working on 4 different European projects. I tend to take a helicopter view. It comes with age. And I think what you're talking about is things that are really fundamental, but not just in this domain. So you're talking about the granularity of the cited object. You're talking about the dynamicity and the separate updates of these objects, whether within collections or not, including things like versioning and so on. And you're talking about the problem that these things are very highly distributed.
Yes.
And just to remind everyone, these things are actually common to things like curation and provenance and versioning and licensing. So maybe we should talk with all those guys as well and make sure we find a common solution that satisfies all of them. I know that is a great danger of mission creep, but unless we all at least recognize the same problems and try to find a way of moving forward jointly, we're going to get separate solutions in each of these domains, which then don't interoperate successfully.
Totally, because what you do is you want machine actionability of what. Do not look at how humans will be seeing the citation. The citation happens automatically. So whatever you supply has to be agreed with the machines that DataCite or Crossref or whoever sites agrees with.
Sure, I think we are at the moment more figuring out the content which we need to support, and we will come to the implementation and look into solutions which are there.
Yep.
We do not want to develop our own solution. So I don't think we have the means, and it doesn't make sense to have additional solutions.
Okay. So the Scholix folks. No. Okay. Is there people in the Scholix team here?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I really feel like Scholix can help here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think Raina, I think you had your hand up first, and then Uwe.
Yeah.
This is kind of a little bit in response to what you were saying. So I just want to kind of invite maybe the same people here in this room to also come to the data granularity working group session. Because some of these, I mean, there's some overlap, there's some differences with some overlap, and we're kind of discussing a lot of the same problems in terms of how do we denote what's like all these terms and what's what and what really, you know, all these kind of the same concepts. So in a different, maybe a different little light, but a lot of overlap. So I think just invite you to come there, and because we're talking about some of these issues around collection, like the granularity problem with collections and data sets and subsets, and also with licenses and how they fit into the picture and all of that. So so just encouraging to come to that. And also I just wanted to say in response to this editorial idea, that's kind of how we're treating collections, as we're not giving all the necessarily all the underlying components of the collection as authors in the collection. We're just giving the kind of curators the credit at that higher level of the collection. So I think that kind of editorial idea makes a lot of sense in most use cases. That's all.
So for those, I think the folks online, just a second, we've missed the chat. So Moriyama-san, did you want to talk to your comment?
Yes, thank you very much. Mine is a comment. That's yes. If possible, then I would be pleased to find a recommendation, if possible, that our registration agencies should be harmonized to each other, because I know the part of the data DOI in some registration agency has no link to DataCite. So those data sets are always separated from all of the rest of the world. So so registration agency management is also another important portion to complete this system. Yeah, this is my comment. Thank you.
So for those of you, if you don't know, if you are working in Japanese, you are using Japanese Link Exchange as your registration site, and it is not well connected into all of the other registries. Are you guys, I know you've been making progress, how is that going with connection? Yeah?
DataCite.
Email Christian.
Okay, I will. Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't know enough.
Oh, it's okay, I realize it's a high level thing, no problem.
It's also with China, it's a similar problem. They
China,
also have their
Korea.
own UIs, but they have no metadata at all in some places. And
okay.
At least on machine readable.
So Mariana-san, I think for this particular group, we probably will take that issue off of our table and then just continue to work with our friends at DataCite and all the other registries to encourage their harmonization. I love that word.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's bigger than what we can do, but you, my friend, are well positioned to help us there. So fantastic. Uwe, go ahead, and then we'll come back to online.
A very short idea. So actually, this looks quite nice. The problem is at that point, because it's something like a new object, it would also be a good idea once we figured out this looks good and works well. Maybe there should be something like a first repository supporting that type of objects, where, for example, something like a Zenodo for reliquaries, where the people can go and collect all the stuff, because at Pangea we can have those reliquaries, but our childs can only be Pangea data sets. And so the idea would be to have something like a repository that would support that metadata concept and then register those in DataCite as DOIs. So you have a solution already?
No, a solution. It's just a sort of slightly parallel comment and thought, which is that, you know, people, when they put in effort to kind of create a data set which goes into a repository, and there's a lot of effort that kind of goes into prepare it. For me, that's like it's a curated sort of data. And what we're talking about here is it's not quite at the same degree as somebody else's particular slice and their view. But so is there a question about kind of, okay, what would be a high prestige item to kind of cite here or not? That's probably a point of controversy there, but.
This particular use case is like rocking the world here. If we can connect the IPCC reports down to the scientists and data managers that supported, for my world, that's the rock star moment. So for other worlds, that might be a little bit different, but if that can happen, like that'll be like, I can retire.
Yeah, there's also a discussion within IPCC to make some of the contributors more visible. At the moment, they are more looking into contributing authors and something like that. But I think that applies for those who provide the scientific data underneath or do the scripting as well.
It would be amazing.
It would be really great.
But to Uwe's point about the Zenodo of reliquaries, is anybody from Zenodo here or online? Okay, we have talked to them, and there's a warmth around this project. There are no promises, but there's a warmth. I think we have. There were hands online, and you may have just gotten frustrated with us for not calling you. So if you could just pop your hands back up, we promise to be better. And somewhere, Vin had his hand up, and there was another hand that went up.
Two extra landscape pointers. The one is that there's also, apart from an architecture of how these things relate to one another, I think, as Keith has sort of pointed out, there are workflow implications. And there's a new standard for scholarly notification that may be of interest to the working group, because it's about sending workflow-related events between infrastructure components in the research data environment. And then the other landscape thing is that we are increasingly encountering and doing work in the field of annotation of research objects and outputs and writing that to scientific graphs. And it will be fantastic if we can use more or less a unified approach to referencing subsets of data objects and have it exactly the same kind of conventions or rules for referencing parts of PDFs or somewhere on a website in HTML and so on, because in the annotation world, we're continuously faced with unambiguously identifying a subpart of a resource in the web.
Now we have the same for the CMIP data, but it's complicated because the granularity is so low and across multiple DOIs.
Yes.
The uptake is not that great at the moment.
Yes.
Put it this way.
So I'm trying to sort of synthesize this all in my mind. And I've been following the the proto working group for the 2 years that you've been doing this, and I'm still getting my head around it. And I do think what I'm hearing here, and I think like Keith's point was really good, that you have a whole lot of concerns bundled into your use cases. And so I think we really need to think about separating those concerns. And we need to be very careful thinking about what are the human concerns and what are the machine concerns. And there are some things that we may not be able to have machines do yet. And that's where like this idea of a review paper, which to me in this context is the methods section, and to just let humans do the interpretation for credit. Credit is a human concern ultimately.
Yeah, true.
And so we need to really be careful about what concerns we're trying to address. And I think once we start doing that, we will see that there are solutions available for some of the concerns. And then maybe what the working group can do is try and demonstrate how we can bundle those together into an overall solution. So we're gonna have a conversation this afternoon about the dynamic data citation, and Deb and Shelley will be presenting there. And I do think that DDC does address some of this, but not the full question. I do think FDOs address a good chunk of this, but not all of this. And I do think, and the PID kernel, there has been little discussion of the PID kernel. I think we need to really get back to that, to the real fundamentals, the really little fine grained stuff. So I guess I'm not exactly sure what I'm saying, except that, that let's try and chunk this into little pieces so that we can, because I think there are solutions for the little pieces, but when we put this all together in this reliquary concept, it is a collection of spiritual objects, and it's just like, whoa.
God, I got that on a recording. I'm using it.
So, but I think you're getting these use cases, and it's great. I think we need to get use cases outside of the earth sciences. And then let's try and really separate the concerns, because I think that will help us figure out a path forward. Because right now, my head starts spinning.
So let me restate to you what I just heard. There's a need. RDA is the right place. It's a worthy endeavor, even though it's large.
Yes.
We need to include others to make sure that what we do is not different than what is the main thinking. We need to get caught up in what's happening, especially within Europe, because there's more thinking there and more alignment that we have to do. And then we need to break it apart into its eaches and figure out exactly what the minimal criteria is to achieve the whole, and then work towards a common goal.
Yeah, so lovely output would be to address these use cases, use these 5 RDA outputs. It may not be that simple.
Oh, that'd be brilliant.
I'm not sure that it will actually boil down that way, but we've heard already several things that, there are parts of RDA that are working on parts of this. And so if this can bring together multiple RDA pieces, that's a huge win, I think.
So, and again, what I'm hearing you say is maybe as we are, and I think we've had some conversation on parts, so in our volumes of content, maybe what we can do as the feedback to you from this meeting is, we have the comments, we have the recording, and then here's how we're considering the pieces, and then maybe the RDA working groups and interest groups that are associated with those, and the intention to connect, if they're not here, which they may not be, although I'm glad Clarity is here because I know there's a very tight connection there, and talk through and make sure we have representatives so we can stay in alignment like that. Okay, Maggie.
So Shelley, Leslie has a question.
Oh, thank you. Just a second, Maggie.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just kind of summarizing what Mark and Keith and a couple of the others are saying, just bearing in mind that this is a spin-off from the Earth Science, Space Science Interest Group within RDA. And as you can see, most of our use cases are Earth Space Sciences. Am I hearing that this should be going across the whole of RDA? And if so, how do we build that into our calculations and work plan?
Oh, it was intended. Don't worry, Leslie, we had that. I just needed an IG home. Don't worry.
Oh, I think we need to make it, but we can't be discipline specific.
No, it can't be discipline specific. No, it just has a home. Just has a home. Does that give you ujita? Leslie, are you okay with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always thought it was bigger than our group, but within the Earth Space group, we actually had quite a few use cases to actually get it off the ground. So now it just goes. This meeting now, which is our first official meeting, is telling us there's a need for this wider than what we originally scoped. Although I must admit we knew about it.
Yep. We need to make all disciplines happy. Go ahead, Maggie.
Yeah, so this also ties into my comment that I think that one thing that we have found in the RDA now after 10 years is that we really need to, it's great to have these working groups and interest groups that are really focusing on some groups or some disciplines needs, but we also do need to have much stronger interactivity between different groups, different areas, different themes. And I think these cross-community fertilization workshops that are started now, that's one step because it's connecting groups that have some kind of similar themes, but we also do need to connect across the themes where and when it is necessary and needed and really useful. So this, of course, doesn't mean that every working group meeting should have 2,000 people in it and last for 2,000 hours. That's not going to help. We need to chunk it out into these parts where it really works, so we can overlap and we can communicate and bring in people from other working groups as guests to our own meetings. So I think that's important. But another thing is also, now people have mentioned dynamic citations, PID kernel, collections, etc. I just want to say that a lot of this work was done 4, 5, 6 years ago and is now partially outdated because IT has moved on, research data management has moved on, and many other things have happened in between. So there is really a need to go back and somehow either say that this is actually a deprecated output now, we need to start from scratch again, or these and these and these parts of the recommendation are now really should be considered as well, maybe not as applicable as they were originally. So just as an example, for the PID kernel information profile things, we are now working on that outside of RDA in another context in the Fair Digital Object Forum, because we need the PID kernel to get our idea about fair digital objects, the technical specifications to work. So we identified that several of the recommendations are not at all suitable for the fair digital object concept. So, but now we are stuck in how do we continue in terms of creating a new recommendation, a new technical specification, and get it accepted also by the RDA. So this is one of the things I hope that we can move on and discuss with Tab.
Oh, I hope so.
Co-chairs.
I feel like that's a really great reason to have a conversation with Tab. I think they should solve that problem.
Yeah, but so I'm in the Fair Digital Object Fabric interest group. I'm one of the co-chairs there, so I hope to be able to see if we can start some work on this now.
Excellent. That's brilliant. Okay. We have 6 minutes left. Deb, would you like to say something inspiring to make sure that
It's pretty late at night. I'm not sure I can be inspiring at this moment.
all right, I'll give it a go, and then you just fix it, okay? Thank you all for coming, and everybody online. There's a good number of folks online as well, so thank you all. If we did not get to your question and you're still burning to ask it, if you're here, then talk to Martina, frankly. I'll do my best, but come on, people. And if you're not, certainly you can reach to any of the co-chairs. Please join the working group. Please stay with us, even if you're lurking, or recommend it to folks that you think should come that weren't here. So, because we do intend to do something that is meaningful, and it's only meaningful if we have the flex and muscle of RDA behind it, and that's everybody, that's people. Let's see, we have not yet set up our working meetings, so we'll send out the ubiquitous ways of doing that, possibly a doodle poll, pick those meetings and get us all started. And likely we'll have to spin folks up. We'll make recordings available, but there'll be an opportunity to bring your teammates and colleagues to get included if they were not here at RDA. And we definitely would welcome them. So thank you all.
May I add something?
Yes.
As we have called for new use cases, it might be worthwhile if someone has a look into our draft reliquary, so the links are in the slide deck, which should be accessible for you, and just come up with your own use case so that we can bring it in and consider it when we go forward. That would be great. If someone has a new use case, please provide it to us.
Or if you think you have one, just send a note.
Yeah.
You don't have to get your own cocktail napkin out. So we want you to join without barriers. So if you have a use case and you're just noodling around and want to talk about it, that's okay too.
Is it okay to use beer mats?
Beer mats. Yes. But if the ink runs too much, then it's hard to actually articulate the lines. So just, choose your medium carefully. Thank you all. Good night, Deb. Good night, Leslie.
So